There is a particular kind of silence that settles into a house after a child goes missing. It isn't the absence of sound. It's the absence of a future. The missing footsteps on the stairs. The missing slam of a screen door. The missing sound of a voice calling out, "I'm home." Renata Alvarez had lived inside that silence for 9 years. Her son, Mateo, was 17 when he disappeared from a highway rest stop outside Albuquerque, New Mexico, during a family road trip to visit his grandmother in Arizona. He had gone to the vending machines. He never came back to the car. 9 years later, Renata was 46 years old, and the woman she used to be, a warm, easily laughing elementary school teacher who kept a garden and hosted Taco Tuesdays for the whole block, had been slowly replaced by someone the neighborhood knew only as Mateo's mother. She still taught. She still smiled when the job required it. But everything underneath had been rebuilt around one unanswered question, brick by brick, for nearly a decade. This is her story. The knock came on a Thursday morning in early spring. Detective Aaron Cole had worked Mateo's case since the beginning, back when he was a junior investigator with more hope than experience. 9 years had turned that hope into something quieter. Not gone exactly, but weathered, the way faith gets weathered by too many years of silence answering every prayer. Renata knew, the moment she opened the door and saw his face, that this wasn't a visit about progress. He told her, as carefully as anyone can deliver such news, that the department was moving Mateo's file to inactive status. No leads in over 3 years. The FBI's active involvement had ended 18 months earlier. The case would remain technically open, it would always remain open, he promised her that much. But there would be no one actively working it anymore. No fresh eyes. No new resources. Just a folder in a drawer, waiting for a miracle no one expected to come. Renata didn't cry. She had cried enough years ago that her body seemed to have run out of a certain kind of tears. She simply nodded, thanked him for coming in person instead of calling, and closed the door. Then she did what she always did when grief threatened to swallow her whole. She went to Mateo's room. Nothing had changed there in 9 years. His guitar still leaned against the wall, slightly out of tune from years of no one playing it. His acceptance letter to a community college music program sat framed on the desk. An acceptance he'd received 2 weeks before he disappeared. An acceptance he never got the chance to say yes to. His bed was still made the way he'd left it. Blue comforter. One corner slightly crooked because Mateo had never once in his life made a bed properly. She sat on the edge of that bed for a long time, the way she did most difficult mornings, and let herself remember the sound of his laugh before she made herself get up and face the day. The call came just after noon, from a number with a country code Renata didn't recognize. Ordinarily, she wouldn't have answered. In 9 years, she'd learned exactly how cruel strangers could be to a desperate mother. Fake psychics, con artists, people who wanted attention more than they wanted to help. She had built calluses against hope for a reason, but something made her pick up. The woman on the line introduced herself as Marisol Nunez, a caseworker with a shelter for exploited migrant workers in Guadalajara, Mexico. She explained, in careful bilingual English, that she had grown up in Albuquerque before her family moved south, and that Mateo's disappearance had haunted the community there for years. His face on posters at the very same rest stop where it happened. A story that had never quite faded from local memory, the way most missing person cases eventually do. 3 days earlier, Marisol said, a group of exploited farm laborers had been brought into her shelter following a raid on an illegal labor operation outside the city. Most were adult men from Central America, but there was one young man among them who didn't fit. American accent buried under years of forced Spanish, refusing to give a name that matched any of his fabricated documents, flinching whenever anyone raised a hand near him, even to hand him food. Marisol said she hadn't been sure at first. It had been 9 years, after all, and the boy in the old news photos had been a teenager. But something about his eyes, and a small scar above his left eyebrow that she'd noticed in an old article photo, had stayed with her for 2 sleepless nights until she felt she had to call. Before phoning Renata, she'd already alerted local authorities and requested a formal identity verification through international channels. Renata pulled her car. She'd been driving to the grocery store, onto the shoulder of the road, and simply sat there, hands shaking too hard to hold the wheel. She had heard false leads before. A boy who looked similar in a photo from Texas. A tip that placed Mateo working construction in Denver, which turned out to be someone else entirely. Every false lead had cost her something, some fragile piece of herself she never quite got back. But Marisol hadn't asked for money. She hadn't wanted press or attention or anything at all except that Renata listen, and she had gone to the authorities before she'd even called. That detail, more than any other, cracked something open in Renata's chest that she'd spent years keeping sealed shut. Within 2 hours, Detective Cole called back, his voice unsteady in a way she'd never heard from him before. Mexican authorities had confirmed the shelter's report and flagged it through Interpol's channels, connecting it to Mateo's still-open file. For the first time in 9 years, Renata felt something dangerous stir beneath the grief she'd learned to live inside of. Hope. She booked a flight to Guadalajara before she allowed herself time to reconsider. Detective Cole urged caution, the way he always did, reminding her gently of the collapse she'd suffered 4 years earlier after a false lead in El Paso had drained both her savings and something harder to replace. Her ability to hope without being afraid of the cost. He reminded her that Mexican authorities were capable, that international identity verification took time, that rushing down there alone could complicate a delicate process. Renata understood every word. None of it mattered anymore. For 9 years she had been told to wait. Wait for leads. Wait for lab results. Wait for jurisdictions to coordinate, for budgets to allow overtime, for anyone at all to tell her something real. She had waited through birthdays that came and went with an empty chair at the table, through a life that kept moving forward around a hole shaped exactly like her son. She was done waiting from a kitchen table 2,000 miles away. The flight was short compared to the years that had led up to it, but it felt like the longest few hours of her life. She sat with her forehead against the window and ran through the same timeline she'd repeated silently 1,000 times before. The rest stop, the vending machines, the 11 minutes between when Mateo left the car and when she went looking for him. 11 minutes. That was all it had taken for her entire world to come apart. She thought about the boy who used to fall asleep with his guitar still in his hands. The boy who cried at sad movies and pretended he didn't. The boy who once spent an entire summer teaching himself 3 chords just so he could play Happy Birthday badly and off-key at her birthday dinner. And how she had laughed so hard she'd nearly cried, not knowing that memory would become one of the ones she clung to hardest in the years after he vanished. She wondered, somewhere over the Sonoran desert, whether that boy still existed inside whoever she was about to meet. Marisol was waiting at the airport, exactly as promised. A woman in her 50s with kind, exhausted eyes, the particular exhaustion of someone who has spent decades absorbing other people's worst days. She hugged Renata without hesitation. In the car, she explained everything more carefully. The young man had arrived at the shelter disoriented, malnourished, and carrying no identification beyond a forged work permit under a name that wasn't his own. He didn't speak much. When he did, it was mostly in Spanish, fluent but strangely formal, the Spanish of someone who had learned it out of necessity rather than upbringing. Occasionally, under stress, English slipped out instead, flattened and rusty, like a language he hadn't used freely in a very long time. "I don't want to give you false hope," Marisol said gently, navigating the evening traffic. "But I've worked with survivors of forced labor for almost 20 years. I know what fear like this looks like. Whatever happened to him, it happened for a very long time." Renata couldn't speak. Her whole body had narrowed down to the next few minutes. The shelter was a modest converted building on a quiet street, deliberately unremarkable from the outside. Inside, it smelled like coffee and clean linen, the specific, deliberate warmth of a place built for people who had forgotten what warmth felt like. A staff member led them down a hallway to a small sitting room. "He knows someone is here to see him," Marisol said quietly. "I told him only that a woman had come a long way. He agreed to it. That's more than he's given anyone since he arrived." The door opened. For one suspended moment, Renata's mind simply refused what her eyes were telling her. The boy from the photographs, 17, soft-jawed, easy-dimpled smile, was gone. In his place stood a man in his mid-20s, too thin, shoulders drawn in as if trying to take up less space in the world. Sun-damaged skin, a jagged scar along one forearm that hadn't been there before. Eyes that moved constantly, door, window, Marisol, door, cataloging every possible exit the way a person does when stillness has never once felt safe. But the small scar above his left eyebrow, faint now but unmistakable, from a bicycle accident when he was 9. And the eyes themselves, the particular warm brown, the way the left one crinkled slightly more than the right. "Mateo," she whispered. He flinched at the name like it had physically struck him. He didn't run. He didn't deny it either. He simply stood there, staring at her with an expression Renata had only seen once before, on a burn victim in a hospital waiting room years ago. The look of someone being shown a photograph of a life they weren't sure they were allowed to still claim. "Nobody's called me that in a long time," he said finally. His voice was rough, unpracticed in English, but the accent underneath, flattened New Mexico vowels, nearly broke her where she stood. "I never stopped looking," Renata said. 9 years. I never once stopped." Something in his face cracked, like ice giving way under quiet pressure. "They told me you moved on," he said. "They told me a long time ago that nobody remembered." He full story emerged slowly, over days, in sessions with a trauma counselor present, Marisol translating whenever grief made even simple words feel foreign in his mouth. At the rest stop, a van with hazard lights blinking had been parked near the vending machines. A common tactic, investigators later confirmed, used by a labor trafficking operation that targeted isolated teenagers along interstate corridors, offering help with a broken-down car to anyone who paused long enough to be approached. Mateo had always been the kind of kid who couldn't walk past someone who looked like they needed help. He was moved across state lines within days, then eventually across the border, funneled into agricultural and construction labor operations that relied on debt bondage and fabricated immigration documents to keep their workers compliant and afraid to seek help. He was told repeatedly that his mother had been informed he'd run away, that the search had been called off within a year. Lies specific enough, delivered by people practiced enough, to be believed by a terrified 17-year-old with no way to check. Over the years, his identity was worn away in layers. New names, new fabricated histories he was forced to memorize, deliberate isolation from anyone who might recognize the boy underneath. He described the erasure as the cruelest part, more than any single act of violence. The slow, patient destruction of his own certainty about who he used to be. He'd been part of the group rescued in the raid 3 days before Marisol called. Not through any dramatic escape, but through sheer chance, one crew among several caught in a coordinated law enforcement operation targeting the broader network. He hadn't given his real name to anyone. He'd almost stopped believing it still belonged to him. Renata listened to all of it in careful pieces, over days, in a small room that smelled like coffee and antiseptic soap. She understood, in the particular way only a mother can, that the boy in the old photographs and the man in front of her were connected by blood and memory but separated now by something violence had built between them. Something no reunion, however longed for, could simply undo. He asked her once, quietly, whether people back home would look at him differently. Whether the town would see him as broken. Whether the boy who used to play badly tuned guitar at family dinners was gone for good, replaced by whoever this stranger had become in 9 years of surviving. Renata told him the truth, because after 9 years of lies built to control him, she refused to add even one more, however gentle it might have felt. "You're not the same boy," she said. "You can't be. I wouldn't want you to pretend you are. But you were never only that boy to me, Mateo. You were my son before you could walk. You're still my son now. Nothing that was done to you changes that. Not one thing." He cried then. Not the careful, guarded tears of earlier sessions, but something older, something that seemed to come from a much younger version of himself, finally allowed to believe it was safe enough to break. It took nearly 4 months before Mateo was medically and legally cleared to return to the United States. Renata stayed in Guadalajara the entire time, learning the slow, unglamorous rhythms of a recovery with no shortcuts and no map. Some days were victories only the mother of a trafficking survivor could measure. A full night's sleep without waking in terror. A meal finished without flinching at a raised voice nearby. A memory of childhood offered voluntarily, without the reflexive apology he'd learned to attach to almost everything he said. Other days were setbacks no amount of love could shortcut past. Panic that arrived without warning. Hours of silence. A trust that had to be rebuilt one small, unremarkable moment at a time. Not through grand gestures, but through Renata simply staying, again and again, proving through sheer repetition what words alone could never prove. When they finally landed in Albuquerque, there were no crowds, no cameras. Renata had asked for exactly that, and the department had quietly honored it. Only Detective Cole waited near the gate, standing a little apart to give them space, his eyes suspiciously bright in a way he clearly hoped no one would mention. At the house, Renata did something she'd resisted for 9 years. She gently packed away the guitar, the framed acceptance letter, the untouched bed. Not thrown away, never thrown away, but moved carefully to make room for a 26-year-old man who needed a door that locked from the inside and a life built for who he was now, not only who he'd been at 17. Mateo stood in the doorway of his old room for a long time before he spoke. "You kept it exactly the same," he said. "For a long time, changing it felt like giving up on you," Renata answered. "I couldn't do that. But you're home now. It doesn't need to be a shrine anymore. It just needs to be your room." He nodded slowly, and for the first time since she'd found him, Renata saw something in his face that wasn't fear or grief or the careful blankness he'd learned to survive on. It was the smallest possible flicker of the boy who used to laugh too easily, checking cautiously to see if that version of himself might still be somewhere inside him, waiting to be let back out. Renata learned, is not one tearful reunion in a shelter in Guadalajara. It is 1,000 ordinary days stitched carefully together. Therapy appointments, hard nights, small breakthroughs, the long, unglamorous work of teaching a nervous system that safety is allowed to exist again. Marisol still runs her shelter. She and Renata speak every few weeks, and Renata has told her, more than once, that there's no way to repay what she did. Noticing a stranger's face, refusing to look away when looking away would have been so much easier. Marisol always answers the same way. "I only made one phone call. You made 9 years of them. The old posters are gone from the rest stop now." Renata took the last one down herself on a quiet morning and stood there a long moment with the faded paper in her hands before folding it carefully and putting it away. Not evidence of a tragedy anymore, but proof of how far love is willing to travel and how long it is willing to wait when it simply refuses to let go. If the story moved you, remember what it's really about. Not just one family's impossible reunion, but the quiet power of a single person choosing to notice, to speak up, and to refuse to look away. You never know whose 9-year search you might help end with one phone call. Thank you for watching. If this story touched you, please consider liking, commenting, and subscribing. It helps us keep telling stories like Renata and Mateo's.